Greetings. We're going to be looking at a subject that is of just immense importance. It's understanding the Israel and Palestinian issue. Not only does this have ramifications in the political world, but it ultimately has ramifications in the biblical world and Bible prophecy. But we're going to focus on what we should understand about the Israel-Palestinian issue. Now, to do that, we need to go back almost 2,000 years. And we're going back to what is referred to as the Second Jewish Revolt, or the Bar Kokhba uprising or rebellion. That was 132 to 135 AD. Now, Bar Kokhba, initially Ben Koziba, he was championed by a leading rabbi of the day, Rabbi Akiva, as the Messiah of Israel. Well, his name, Ben Koziba, was changed to Bar Kokhba, son of the star, and he led a revolt against Rome. It was a short-lived revolt. It started in 132 AD. It was ended in 135 AD. But at Bar Kokhba's defeat, he died at the Battle of Bitar. The emperor of Rome at that time, Hadrian, was incensed that this uprising would take place. The first uprising was back in 70 AD that many of our people watching this are familiar with, in the destruction of the nation of Israel and Jerusalem and the temple. But this second Jewish revolt was just, in a sense, not anticipated by Hadrian. So when it was done, Hadrian wanted to wipe out every vestige of Jewishness from that area of the world. So what he did is he changed the name of Jerusalem to Aelia Capitolina, and he changed the name of Israel to Palestina, or what comes down to us today as Palestine. Again, to wipe out any kind of Jewishness to that area of the world. Well, that change has reverberated down through history and has had a major impact on the political scene today, the scene in the Middle East, even an understanding of the Word of God and the Bible. The city of Jerusalem was under siege and changed hands many, many times from 135 AD up until the Ottoman Empire, 1516 AD. For example, in 313 AD, the Byzantine rule of Jerusalem, that's the Roman rule, would take place. 300 years later, in 614 AD, the Persians would take control of the city of Jerusalem. In 629 AD, Emperor Heraclius, he would restore Byzantine rule to Jerusalem. 638 AD, Jerusalem is captured by Caliph Omar ibn al-Khattab 6 years after Muhammad's death. In 878 AD, Egyptian Ahmed ibn Tulun captures Jerusalem. And then Jerusalem would return to Abbasid rule in 905 AD and taken by the Egypt again in 941 AD. This would continue. In 1071, an army of Turkish mercenaries, the Seljuks, captured Jerusalem, and then finally the Crusaders in 1099 AD, following the command of Pope Urban II's call, conquered Jerusalem. Well, in 1187, we have that Muslim military and political leader, Saladin, who would capture Jerusalem. The Crusaders would regain control in 1229 AD. 1244 AD, the Turks would conquer Jerusalem. The Mongolian chief, Balagi Khan, captures Jerusalem in 1260 AD. This was a very brief capture or rule that he had, because later that year the Mamluks conquered Jerusalem And finally, in 1516 AD, Sultan Selim I of Turkey would capture the city of Jerusalem. So these are just some of the changes that Jerusalem went under for these 1400 years. Well, 1516 AD, this would start the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire controlled that area of the Middle East for 400 years until the end of World War I. That is extremely important as we consider the Israel-Palestinian issue, because what ended up taking place is that they would choose the wrong side in World War I, the Ottomans. But prior to looking at that, I want us to look at an article, The Name Rome Gave the Land of Israel, by Elliot Green from the Focus on Jerusalem Library. Here's what he says. The Arab treatment of geographical names after their conquest of the country, 635 to 640 of the Common Era, that's AD, was paradoxical. The Quran mentions the Holy Land divinely assigned to the people of Israel. That's Surah verse 12 and 20 through 21. However, he goes on, the Arabs later on did not see this land as a separate country. They typically consider the country merely an undifferentiated part of Bilad ash-Sham, usually translated as Syria or Greater Syria. Now this is important as we move on in our look at the Israel-Palestinian issue. This view lasted until the end of the British Mandate period, as we see from Arab writings and political declarations, such as Arab testimony before the Anglo-American Commission of Inquiry on Palestine in 1946. In October of 1915, October 24th, Sir Henry McMahon was British High Commissioner in Cairo. He issued a letter called the McMahon Letter, whereby the British promised to support the founding of an Arab state in the Middle East. This state was to include areas of present-day Syria, east of Damascus, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia. This letter was issued to gain Arab support in World War I. The Ottoman Empire became the ally of the Germans, a big mistake on their part, because as the Axis powers would ultimately lose the war, and the Ottoman Empire joining with them and the Germans who headed it up, that was the demise of the Ottoman Empire. In 1916, March 9th, the Sykes-Picot Agreement was entered into between Britain and France on how the Ottoman Empire would be divided after the defeat of the Axis powers. It was a foregone conclusion at this point that the Axis powers would lose the war. And so the Sykes-Picot Agreement was entered into. What this did was to establish French and British mandates to carry out the land division. How are we going to divide up the Ottoman Empire? Well, these mandates were given to Britain and to France. In the years following, both in Britain and France, there was much criticism of this agreement. The agreement was officially replaced by the Allies at the San Remo Conference in April 1920. And we'll have more to say on the San Remo Conference, which is an extremely important conference and in many ways the foundation for what should be understood even today about the Israel-Palestinian issue. Well, this was replaced by the San Remo Conference Agreement when the mandate for Palestine was conferred upon Britain. Britain had the mandate for Palestine. Now, we should understand, the countries in the Middle East that area of our world are very new, relatively speaking. They're not ancient countries. For example, Iraq received her independence in 1932. Saudi Arabia the same year. Egypt became an independent governing entity in 1936. Lebanon in 1943. Syria in 1945. Jordan in 1946. Libya in 1951. Kuwait in 1961. Bahrain in 1971. And Qatar again in 1971. So we're not dealing with ancient history. We're going back then less than 100 years when these nations came on the scene. It was a direct result of Ottoman Empire joining the wrong side in World War I, and this mandate being given to France and Britain to divide up that landmass into nation states. And we'll get to Israel shortly, which also became a state, as we are well aware, I think, in 1948. Well, in November 2nd, 1917, the Balfour Declaration was issued. Lord Balfour of England, and it read this way: His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. It being clearly understood that nothing will be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by the Jews in any other country. Now, it's very important to note that in Britain's mandate, it was to establish in Palestine a national home for the Jewish people. In Palestine, historic Palestine, and we'll look at that shortly, this home was to be established for the Jewish people, the entirety of Palestine. The Balfour Declaration was a very important step in ultimately Israel becoming a nation, although they would not get nearly the landmass that was intended in the Balfour Declaration. Well, in December of 1917, British General Allenby entered Jerusalem, and he put an end to 4 centuries of Ottoman rule. And Britain would rule from 1917 to 1948 over that land mass that had become known as the area of Palestine, dating all the way back to 135 AD, when that was changed by the Roman emperor because of his hatred for what had taken place in the revolt by Bar Kokhba. In June 28th of 1919, the mandate given to Britain, incorporating the Balfour Declaration in it, was approved by the Council of the League of Nations, giving it international approval. Now, the League of Nations, the forerunner of the United Nations, but there was a mandate that was now given that the Jewish people would have a homeland in Palestine, and the Balfour Declaration was rolled into this mandate, thus giving it not just English or Britain approval, but international approval. We now come to the San Remo Conference in San Remo, Italy, April 24th, 1920. England, France, Italy, and Japan, with the United States as an observer, divided the Ottoman Empire into 3 mandates: Iraq, Syria, and Palestine. Now, until the defeat in World War I, the 400-year-old empire, the Ottoman Empire, had spread itself throughout the Middle East. France now would oversee Syria, while Iraq and Palestine fell under Great Britain. The resolution included the Balfour Declaration, written for or by England's Lord Balfour in 1917. Howard Grief, who was a Jewish attorney and probably as much an expert as anyone on the San Remo Conference, who died a few years ago, said the resolution, which was adopted by the League of Nations, established several important precedents. In Grief's book, The Legal Foundation and Borders of Israel under International Law, Grief explains that the resolution gave the Jewish people exclusive legal and political rights in Palestine. It also gave the Arabs the same rights for the remainder of the Middle East. Quote, the Arabs got the lion's share. They got Syria, which was subsequently divided between Syria and Lebanon, Grief said. They got all of Mesopotamia and all of Arabia. This is what Balfour himself said, quoting him, "Why are you complaining? You are getting all these lands, or we're granting a niche." He called it a niche to the Jewish people. We're going to get Palestine, Grief said. Solomon Ben-Mira wrote an article in American Thinker titled "Israel's Right to Exist as a Jewish Homeland." This was written on April 25th, 2010. And here's what he wrote. The legal title to Palestine was officially transferred from the League of Nations when Turkey was dispossessed of its rights to the region at the Paris Peace Conference a year earlier. Turkey is the Ottoman Empire. To the Jewish people, who became the national beneficiary under a mandate awarded to Britain, thereby designated, speaking of Britain, as the trustee. The transfer of title and the sovereignty of the Jewish people in Palestine remain binding in international law to this day, and to this day as well. Similarly, equivalent national rights were conferred to the Arabs in both Syria, Lebanon, and present-day Iraq under two other transitional mandates awarded to France and Britain, respectively. It should therefore, he writes, be apparent that the legitimacy of the present Arab states of Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq derives from the same international law which reconstituted the Jewish nation in Palestine. July 24th, 1922. What happened here was that the League of Nations created the British Mandate for Palestine, providing for an area of 43,000 square miles, or 111,369 square kilometers. Britain, however, had already demarcated the part of the mandate east of the Jordan River as Trans-Jordan. What Britain did is that they had given to the Arabs the promise that they could have a landmass east of the Jordan River. And it became known as Trans-Jordan because it was everything across the Jordan River, everything east of the Jordan River. Everything west of the Jordan River was to be a Jewish state or a Jewish nation. Now, this was not the intent of the Balfour Declaration. The intent was that the Jewish people would have all of Palestine on both the west and the east side. Because the Arab nations joined with Britain and the Allies in the war, they gave to the Arabs the right to a state east of the Jordan River, across the Jordan River, Trans-Jordan. The League of Nations confirmed the mandate for Palestine, which included the Balfour Declaration. And the British government was thereby committed, quote, to place the country under such political, administrative, and economic conditions as will secure the establishment of the Jewish national home, close quote. The emphasis was on the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine, not on Palestine as a Jewish national home. And there's a big difference with that. The reason being because a Jewish national home in Palestine would be all of Palestine. But Palestine as a Jewish national home would leave the possibility of another state or nation being located in that historical land area. In August of 1922, Transjordan was created. On September 16, 1922, the League of Nations accepted. Now, this goes against what they'd agreed on just a few months earlier. But the League of Nations accepted the British demarcation of Transjordan, as it was discussed in the Churchill Command White Paper, about 32,500 square miles, roughly 76% of the area of the Jewish national home were given over to Transjordan. 3/4 of what was promised to the Jewish people for a national home in the Balfour Declaration, in the San Remo Conference Declaration and Agreement, and the League of Nations mandate earlier, all of that was thrown away by what was done in August of 1922 and signed on September 16, 1922. The Jewish national home now had an area of about 10,500 square miles. Jews were barred from living or owning property east of the Jordan River, violating Article 15 of the British Mandate for Palestine, which said, quote, no discrimination of any kind shall be made between the inhabitants of Palestine on the ground of race, religion, or language. No person shall be excluded from Palestine on the sole ground of his religious belief. But this agreement violated what that said. Well, in July of 1937, we have the Peel Commission. The commission, which was headed by Lord Robert Peel, which was appointed in August of 1936. They heard a great deal of testimony in Palestine about that area. In July of 37, they issued its recommendations to abolish the mandate and partition the country between the two peoples. Only a zone between Jaffa and Jerusalem would remain under the British mandate and international supervision. Now, this is the Peel Commission. The Peel Commission concluded the only logical solution to resolving the contradictory aspirations of the Jews and Arabs was the partition of Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states. Now, this goes completely against what the Balfour Declaration said, the San Remo Conference Agreement said, and so on, which we've looked at previously. The Arabs, though, rejected the plan because it would have forced them to accept the creation of a Jewish state and required some Palestinians to live under, quote, Jewish domination, close quote. The Zionists opposed the Peel Plan's boundaries because they would have been confined to little more than a ghetto of 5,000 out of the 26,700 square kilometers remaining in Palestine. Virtually nothing for a nation. Nevertheless, the Zionists decided to negotiate with the British. while the Arabs refused to consider any compromise. May 17, 1939, we have the MacDonald White Paper. It was published by Britain. Among other restrictions, now at this point the Holocaust was going on, World War II. And among other restrictions, the White Paper restricted Jewish immigration into Palestine to 15,000 per year through 1944. Now, the Holocaust was going on. We ultimately found out that 6 million Jewish people were slaughtered by the Nazi regime. And the White Paper restricted 15,000 a year for 5 years, a total of 75,000 that could go into Palestine. After which, at the end of 1944, no more Jewish people could be let in without Arab consent. Now, many of the British, such as Winston Churchill, condemned this. But this was done to appease the Arab world. It was in direct violation of the Balfour Declaration, San Remo Conference, and all legal and ethical responsibilities Britain had under these internationally recognized documents. Well, we know that the Holocaust, 1939 to 1945, and Britain's restrictions on immigration continued throughout the Holocaust, and actually up to the establishment of Israel, the nation of Israel, in 1948. May 25th, 1946, Transjordan would become an independent state. The country became the Hashemite Kingdom of Transjordan when the ruling Emir was redesignated as king. Now, I want to pause and just state what is, generally speaking, the argument for a state of Palestine. Well, you can see on this map, Palestine 1946, and it's all green with a Palestinian flag on it with very, very little white spots, which would be Jewish. So often what you find is a map showing the area of present-day Israel prior to 1948 as Palestinian land. They then argue that the Jewish people stole their land in 1947 and 1948. In essence, they're working backwards. What they're doing is that they're saying that the conflict we have today, there's a Palestinian people. We don't have our land. And because of that, we can just backtrack and understand that this land has always been our land and the Jewish people took it. So the problem with this position, at least one of the problems, is that the history of the conflict did not start in 1946. And just because the area was called Palestine does not mean it was an Arab land area. To the contrary, which we've seen already and we'll see even more so in a few minutes, but this is one of the arguments of the Palestinians, but they work back from the present to 1946 and say, because there's a Palestinian people as the world understands it today, and many of them are homeless and we were driven out of the land, this was initially our land. It doesn't work if you start with the historical background and understand it. In November 29th of 1947, you have the UN resolution and the area of Palestine given to the Jewish people in 1922 by the League of Nations. Now, that was only, if you remember, about 1/4 of the historic landmass called Palestine. It was now divided into a Jewish and an Arab state. So now in that 24% that was to be a Jewish state, the United Nations takes another chunk out of that land and gives it as an Arab state. Now the Jewish people said this isn't right. This is not what was promised us initially. Now you're taking more of our land, but we will accept this. But the Arabs refused. And so it never became a reality legally. In May 1948, Israel was born as a nation among the nations of the world. British rule ended, and the next day, 5 Arab nations attacked: Egypt, Transjordan, Syria, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia. November 30th, 1948, the war ended. And surprisingly, Israel was victorious. Now, as a result of the war, approximately 400,000 to 800,000 Arabs became refugees. And you will find all kinds of figures between those two. I believe that probably the more correct number is the lower figure of 400,000 refugees. And this comes from Dave Dolan in his book, Holy War for the Promised Land. But, quote, the historical evidence suggests that while the Israelis deliberately expelled some Palestinian Arabs following months of bitter fighting, most left of their own volition or at the behest of the local Arab commanders. So the Arab world thought that they would easily win the War of Independence, Israel's War of Independence in 1948. Israel hardly had any weaponry. The Arab nations had the most modern weapons of the day. They vastly outnumbered the Israelis. And yet, and I believe it was unquestionably miraculously that God intervened, Israel won and emerged victorious in that war. Now, the Arab commanders had told the Arabs in that area, leave your home. And when the war is over, it won't be long, you can go back, and you can go back to your home, and you can have your neighbor's home, your Jewish neighbor's home as well. Because Arab and Jews lived side by side up to this point. And many heeded that call. Now, some didn't, and they remained, and their families remain to this day in the area in ownership. But many left. The vast majority left at the behest of the Arab commanders. They joined the enemy then, in essence. Samuel Katz, in his book Battleground, writes about the Arab claim of Jewish expulsion of Arabs. Here's what he says. The fabrication, that's about the Arab claim, the fabrication can most easily be detected by the simple circumstance that at the time the alleged expulsion of the Arabs by Zionists was in progress, nobody noticed it. Foreign newspapermen abounded in the country, but even those most hostile to the Jews saw nothing to suggest that the flight of the Arabs was not voluntary. In the 3 months that the major part of the flight took place, the London Times, a newspaper most notably hostile to Zionism, published 11 leading articles on the situation in Palestine, in addition to extensive news reports. Katz goes on. In none was there even a remote hint that the Zionists were driving Arabs from their homes. Even more pertinent, he writes, no Arab spokesman made such a charge. At the height of the flight, the Palestinian Arabs' chief UN representative, Jamal Husseini, made a long political statement. This was on April 27, 1948. That was not lacking in hostility toward the Zionists, but he did not mention refugees. The Secretary General of the Arab League, Azam Pasha made a fiercely worded political statement on Palestine. It contained not a word about refugees. When 4 months after the war began, the prospect of the flightlings returning, quote, in a few weeks had faded, there were some recriminations. Emil Gori, a member of the Palestinian Arabs' national leadership, said in an interview with the Beirut Daily Telegraph, quote, "The fact that there are these Arab refugees is the direct consequence of the action of the Arab states in opposing partition and the Jewish state. The Arab states agreed upon this policy unanimously, and they must share in the solution of the problem." Now, it's important to note a few things. Number one, there's never been a Palestinian state. Never. Not from the defeat of the Bar Kokhba revolt uprising to this very day. There's never been a Palestinian state. Two, Arabs up to this time, this is up to 1948 we're talking about, were never called Palestinians. It was actually considered an insult. It would be in 1964, when the PLO came into existence, that they brought up the Palestinian people as a propaganda tool. Jewish people, point number three, in the land before the birth of Israel, they were actually referred to as Palestinians. For example, you have or had the Palestinian Post, today the Jerusalem Post, the Palestinian Symphony Orchestra, the Jerusalem Symphony Orchestra, the Palestine Electric Company, the Palestine Potash Company. Those are all Jewish-run utilities or companies. British authorities issued the Jewish passports stamped with the word Palestinian. Remember, the mandate was given to Britain from 1917 to 1948 to establish a homeland in Palestine for Jewish people. Thus, they would give out passports to those residing in that area. And when Jewish people received a passport from Britain at that time, their passports were stamped Palestinian or Palestine. Now, here we can see a passport of an obviously Jewish name, and it's stamped Palestinian or Palestine. This was a period passport. Joshua Ben, it starts out. Son. It's a very clearly a Jewish name, Palestine or Palestinian. The Jewish passports stamped Palestinian. In March 1921, point number 4, when Winston Churchill was British colonial secretary, he visited Jerusalem and met with a delegation of local Arab dignitaries who told him they would brook no sovereign Jewish entity in what they call, these are the local Arab dignitaries, southern Syria. That's from David Fromkin's A Peace to End All Peace, his book. Point number 5. After World War I, Aref al-Aref, who was a colleague of the Mufti Amin al-Husseini, he was the editor of a newspaper called the Syria al-Junubiyya, or Southern Syria. Not Palestine, Southern Syria. It was referred to by the Arabs. Point number 6. There is no such country as Palestine. Palestine is a term the Zionists invented. Our country was for centuries part of Syria. Palestine is alien to us. It is the Zionists who introduced it. Close quote. This was by local Arab leader Ani Bey Abdul Hadi. Wow, that's not what you hear today. Point number 7. In the 1939, the Arab Awakening. Arab historian George Antonius described the status of Palestine. Quote, except where otherwise specified, the term Syria will be used to denote the whole of the country of that name, which is now split into mandated territories of French Syria and Lebanon, and British Palestine and Transjordan. The term Syria will be used. Point number 8. In 1946, a leading Arab historian, he was a Princeton University history professor, Philip Hitti. He reiterated the pan-Arab view when he decried the term Palestinian because it referred to Jews. Quote, there is no such thing as Palestine in history. Absolutely not, he asserted. Point number 9. Ahmed Shakari, who was a Saudi delegate to the UN and later head of the PLO in 1956 in the United Nations Security Council, said this, quote, there is no such thing as Palestine in history. Absolutely not. Close quote. And then point number 10. Zahir Hussein, which was the PLO Executive Committee member, in an interview with the Dutch newspaper Trouw, this was in 1977, March 31st. And here's what he said. The Palestinian people does not exist. The creation of a Palestinian state is only a means for continuing our struggle against the state of Israel for our Arab unity. In reality, today there is no difference between Jordanians, Palestinians, Syrians, and Lebanese. Only for political and tactical reasons do we speak today about the existence of a Palestinian people, since Arab national interests demand that we posit the existence of a distinct Palestinian people to oppose Zionism. It's all a ruse. It's all fake history. It has no basis in history that there was ever a Palestinian state or a Palestinian Arab people. And yet the PLO, which started that fabrication, has done an amazingly good job of deceiving the world into thinking that there was a Palestinian state and a Palestinian nation, and they're the Arab Palestinians today in Israel. It's all fake news. Here, for example, is a dictionary that was put out by France. This was in 1939. And there were flags of the world or of areas of the world. And as you look closely at this dictionary, this was prior, obviously, to Israel becoming a nation, which happened in 1948. This is 1939. You'll notice, for example, the German flag has the Nazi symbol, the swastika. But if you look closely at the flag for Palestine, Notice what the symbol is. It's the Star of David. Now, one would think if this was an Arab area, an Arab state, you wouldn't find the Star of David. And the reason is because the world at that time understood that Palestine was speaking of the Jewish people, not Arabs. They were part of Syria, Greater Syria, or Southern Syria. This lie was started and perpetuated by the Palestinian Liberation Organization, now the Palestinian Authority, and what we'll see is ultimately that they could get a beachfront, a beachhead, to destroy the entire nation of Israel. Now, in 1949, land ownership in Israel after the war, 8.6% of that area was purchased by Jewish people. 71.2% were state lands. They were under the control of Britain, but passed to the nation of Israel when the mandate ended and Israel became a nation in 1948. 16.9% of the land was abandoned by Arab owners. 3.3% remained in possession of Arab owners who didn't flee. So you're only talking about 17% of the land in Israel that was ultimately abandoned by Arab owners, the vast majority of it, at the behest of the Arab commanders, and they voluntarily left. Most of them left voluntarily. They were considered by Israel as part of the enemy. And when the Arab world lost that war, they were not allowed back in the country. The population of the land, there's about 1,000 Jews at the beginning of the Ottoman Empire. Some 50 years later, there was about 10,000 Jews. In 1800, still 10,000 Jews, perhaps 25,000 Christians, and about 250,000 Sunni Muslims. Arab population in Palestine, which is Israel and Jordan, in 1882 was about 260,000 people. Most lived in mud huts without sanitation. The average farm was about 25 acres. There was no separate political or administrative entity before 1914. The area was part of the Ottoman Empire. The political or administrative entity after the war, World War I, would be Britain. But prior to that, there was none. It was just landmass owned by the Ottoman Empire. In 1949, an armistice agreement was entered into with Egypt in February 24th, in Lebanon in March, and Transjordan in April, and Syria in July of that year. Following the Israel War of Independence, 1948, those armistice agreements left Israel with about 7,800 square miles. The land that was to have become part of the, quote, Arab state, about 2,200 square miles. Now, these armistice agreements, that land was divided into the West Bank to the east. Now, that is that roughly 2,200 square miles, and it was occupied and annexed illegally by Jordan, and I'll mention why it's Jordan at this point shortly, and the Gaza Strip on the southern shore of the Mediterranean Sea, occupied and held as an administrative area by Egypt. What the world calls the West Bank, and religious Jews refer to as Judea and Samaria, because it is the biblical heartland, Judea and Samaria. But the West Bank, as the world knows it, was illegally occupied and annexed, not by Israel, but by Jordan. April 24th, 1950, Transjordan became Jordan. And they formally annexed the West Bank, which included East Jerusalem, declaring, quote, complete unity between the two sides of the Jordan and their union in one state, at whose head reigns King Abdullah ibn al-Hussein. And when they illegally annexed and occupied the West Bank, Jordan did, they were now on both sides of the Jordan River. They were not just Transjordan, across the Jordan, on the east side of the Jordan River. They now occupied land on the east side and the west side of the Jordan River. So they dropped the term trans, being on both sides of the Jordan River, and they became known as Jordan. But the important point is that this was an illegal annexation. This was an illegal occupation. It was regarded as illegal. This is Jordan's annexation of the West Bank. It was regarded as illegal and void by the Arab League as well as others. It was recognized at that time only by Britain, Iraq, and Pakistan. The rest of the world did not recognize it. The rest of the world said it was illegal. The annexation of the West Bank more than doubled the population of Jordan. So historically, when we talk about the West Bank and who are the occupiers of the West Bank, it is not Israel. It is the Palestinians. Jordan illegally annexed and occupied it and ultimately turned it over to the so-called Palestinian Arabs today. The occupiers, the ones who illegally are there, are the Palestinian Arabs, not Israel. May of 1964. We have the establishment of the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization. The Palestinian National Covenant was adopted at this time, May of '64. It has been reconfirmed at every subsequent meeting of the Palestinian National Council. Its main theme is that only the Arabs are entitled to self-determination and that the State of Israel has no right whatsoever to exist. Article 1 of the covenant says, Palestine is the homeland of the Palestinian Arab people and an integral part of the great Arab homeland. This is in part. See, it's now that they're raising the supposedly fact of Palestinian Arab people. The covenant goes on. In Article 15, it says this: the liberation of Palestine is a national duty to repulse the Zionists, to purge the Zionist presence from Palestine. The PLO was established with one purpose: to drive the Jewish people out from that area, to destroy the nation of Israel. Article 19 reads in part, the partitioning of Palestine in 1947, this was by the UN, and the establishment of Israel, which happened in 1948 in May, is fundamentally null and void. Now, this covenant is still binding on the Palestinian Authority today. It has never been changed. It goes on in Article 21. The Arab Palestinian people reject all solutions which are substitutes for the total liberation of Palestine. the entire land, area, all of Israel. Article 33 concludes, "This charter shall not be amended, save by a vote of 2/3 of the total membership of the National Congress," which is about 400 people, "of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which would be taken at a special session convened for that purpose." That session has never been convened. This charter has never been abrogated, changed. It is as binding today with the Palestinian Authority as it was in the day it was written by the PLO. And the entire purpose in the Palestinian Authority's mind and actions and legally binding document, the Palestinian National Covenant, is the destruction of the nation of Israel. It was at this time, understand, 1964, that the concept of Palestinian Arab refugees was raised as a propaganda tool by the PLO. And even that there are Palestinian Arab people is propaganda. Now, where is Palestine? When Arabs refer to Palestine, they usually mean the entire area of Israel west of the Jordan River. For example, this is shown in the emblems of the various Palestinian Arab political and terror groups, such as that of the, quote, moderate, close quote, Fatah. They're no moderate organization. But you look on the symbol and the entire state or nation of Israel is in green, it's Palestinian. So when they talk about Palestine, they're talking about the entire nation of Israel. Well, in October of 1973, October 6th, the Yom Kippur War, the Day of Atonement, began on that day when a coalition of Arab forces launched a surprise attack on Israel's most holiest day, the Day of Atonement. It would come to an end on October 26th, that war. But it was a very difficult war for Israel. At one point, they were thinking that their nation was going to be destroyed. But I believe God turned that battle around. And at the end of the war, they were very close to the capital of Egypt, Cairo, and the capital of Syria, Damascus. But pressure from Russia and then the United States coming in stopped that war. But it claimed the lives of 2,569 IDF soldiers, a huge loss. About 7,500 soldiers were wounded. Another 301 soldiers were taken captive, ultimately to be returned to Israel. But it was very, very costly, this war. But what it did to the Arab world, they thought they were going to win. They thought they were on the verge of destroying Israel in the 1973 Yom Kippur War. And when that didn't happen, they realized that they would not be able to destroy, at least any time in the near future, the nation of Israel militarily. So in June of 1974, June 9th, the PLO met and they came up with a stages plan. Now, the PLO again was born with a commitment to the destruction of Israel. That's still the commitment of the Palestinian Authority. And they would consider nothing else. But understanding after the defeat in the Yom Kippur War that they couldn't defeat Israel militarily, what they did, they embarked upon a new three-stage, at this point, strategy, which would become a 10-point strategy later, for Israel's destruction, embodied in the Palestinian Liberation Organization's 1974 political program, commonly known as the Phased Plan. It was adopted at the 12th session of the Palestinian National Council held in Cairo, June 9th, 1974. Now, what this would do would set the stage for what would come in the early 90s. But November of 1988, this phased program, or stages program, had laid dormant for 14 years. They had never initiated, although they agreed upon it. And in 1988, in November of 1988, that phased program was revitalized. The PNC, the Palestinian National Council, met, and they passed a resolution and proclaiming the, quote, establishment of the state of Palestine in the Israeli-occupied territories with Holy Jerusalem as its capital. Salah Khalaf, who at the time was the number 2 PLO leader, said this, quote, the PNC resolutions refine the Palestinian position as adopted in the phased program 14 years ago. He goes on, the PNC session was intended to revitalize this program and to promote a mechanism that will get it moving. Later on in December 18th, 1988, Salah Khalaf told the Kuwaiti newspaper that the PNC statehood declaration meant, quote, first a small state, and then with the help of Allah, it will be made large and expand to the east and west, north and south. In other words, the entire nation of Israel. He told the newspaper that he was interested in the liberation of Palestine, quote, step by step, close quote. The revitalization of the stages program, or the phased program of 1974, which brings us to the Oslo Accords of 1993. The Declaration of Principles, as it became known, was agreed to between Israel and the PLO. This is an agreement on how to proceed toward a permanent agreement that will be initiated in 5 years if all goes as planned. Now we're many years beyond that. So obviously they were highly optimistic. 5 years came and went. But it was an agreement, supposedly, between Israel and the PLO to get a permanent agreement. The agreement, I'm quoting now, is the framework of our national covenant. Now, this is a statement by PLO Representative Abu al-Ainain. It's reported in the U.S. News and World Report of 1993, September. And again, quoting, the agreement, the Oslo Accord agreement, is the framework of our national covenant. We have to accept the deal and wait for a change in the circumstances that could lead to the elimination of Israel. All the Oslo Accords, he is saying, is the framework of our Palestinian national covenant, the destruction of Israel. We don't have any choice at this point, but it can lead to the destruction of Israel. Bassam Abu Sharif, who was political advisor to Yasser Arafat at the time, said this, quote, this is not a peace treaty with Israel. This is the first step in the transfer of authority to Palestinian self-government, close quote. Arafat himself confirmed that, quote, this, the present peace talks and agreement, the Oslo Accords, is the phases plan that we accepted in 1974, close quote. This was reported in the September 11th, 1993 Jerusalem Post. May of 1994, we have the Cairo Agreement. The agreement on the Gaza Strip and the Jericho area, usually referred to as the Cairo Agreement, was finally signed in the Egyptian capital by Israeli Prime Minister Rabin and Yasser Arafat, with American, Soviet, and Egyptian representatives as witnesses. May of 1994, Arafat was secretly recorded in a speech in Johannesburg, South Africa, in a local mosque. Among other things, he said, quote, "You have to understand our main battle is Jerusalem. You have to come and fight a jihad to liberate Jerusalem, your precious shrine." And this is very important. Arafat goes on. What they, the Israelis, are saying is that it is their capital. No, it is not their capital. It is our capital. It is your capital. It is the first shrine of Islam. Again, I have to say, and they entered the mosque as they entered it before. He's quoting from the Quran. Onward to victory. Then what Arafat said in his speech, that was secretly recorded, he likened the Oslo and the Cairo agreements with Israel to the Prophet Muhammad's agreement. That agreement was called the Pact of Hudaybiyah. Muhammad made that with the Quraysh tribe in 628 AD. He did that in order to conquer Mecca. What Muhammad did is he adopted a strategy of agreeing to a 10-year peace, not planning on keeping the agreement, but to lull the Meccans into a false sense of security and to build up his own forces. 2 years later, when his military was strong enough, his soldiers, Muhammad attacked the city when he felt his forces were strong enough to capture it. See, the Pact of Hudaybiyah is what Muhammad did, never intending to keep it, just allowing him to get stronger, and when he was stronger than the Quraysh tribe, he would attack, which he did, and destroy them and take over at that point Mecca. That's a code term, Pact of Hudaybiyah, for what the PLO wants to do, and the PA today. In June of 1994, Arafat again repeated his May 10th statement when, in speaking to a meeting of Palestinian contractors in Tunis, he said the Israel PLO agreement was short-term. And like the agreement the Prophet Muhammad reached with the Quraysh tribe, Pact of Hudaybiyah. In November of 1994, Arafat wrote to a 10-member rejectionist front of PLO and Islamic groups, quote, "Cooperation and understanding between the PLO and the rejectionist organizations is what will lead to the speedy retreat of Israel from the occupied territories in the first stage, until the establishment of a Palestinian state with its capital in Jerusalem. And only a state like that can continue the struggle to remove the enemy from all Palestinian lands. First stage, get a state. From there, other stages until we liberate the entire area, destroy the nation of Israel." This has been the plan all along. April 16, 1995, while speaking in Arabic before a Palestinian audience, Arafat gave a speech. He again mentioned the Pact of Hudaybiyah in relation to the Oslo Agreement, reported in the Jerusalem Post on August 5th, 1995. Arafat said, quote, "We shall look at you tomorrow sitting in Jerusalem, the capital of Palestine. When the Prophet made the peace of Hudaybiyah, I remind you and remind all our people and our Arab nation and our Islamic nation. The tribe of Quraysh objected to make any mention of the title Messenger of Allah. Omar ibn al-Khattab and Ali ibn Abu Talib said, quote, "How can we accept such humiliation of our religion, O Messenger of Allah," close quote. Arafat goes on, "And when we signed the Oslo Accord, if any of you has any objection to that agreement, I have 100. April 18, 1998. In an interview with Egypt's Orbit Television, Arafat reaffirmed the 1974 10-point stages program. It had become a 10-point program by this time. And referred to what he was doing by referencing the Pact of Hudaybiyah and Saladin's conquest of Jerusalem from the Crusaders. June 24th, 2001. There was a Palestinian representative reported in Al Arabi reporting, said this: "Had the U.S. and Israel realized before Oslo that all that was left of the Palestinian national movement and the pan-Arab movement was a wooden horse called Arafat, or the PLO, they would never have opened their fortified gates and let it inside their walls. This effort could have been much better, broader, and more significant had we made it clearer to ourselves that the Oslo Agreement or any other agreement is just a temporary procedure or just a step towards something bigger. We distinguish the strategic, long-term goals from the politically phased goals, which we are compelled to accept temporarily due to international pressure. Palestine, according to the higher strategy, is, quote, from the river to the sea. Palestine in its entirety is an Arab land, the land of the Arab nation. In 2011, in an interview on Al Jazeera TV, senior Palestinian official Abbas Zakai also mentioned this PA stages plan. Quote, "The agreement is based on the borders of June 4th, 1967. While the agreement is on the borders of June 4th, the President, Mahmoud Abbas, understands, we understand, everyone knows that it is impossible to realize the inspiring idea of the great goal in one stroke. If Israel withdraws from Jerusalem, if Israel uproots the settlements, 650,000 settlers, if Israel removes the security fence, what will be with Israel? Israel will come to an end. If I say that I want to remove it from existence, this will be great, but it is hard. This is not a stated policy. You can't say it to the world. You can say it to yourself. The Phases Program, by stages, the National Covenant of the PLO, the destruction of Israel. In 2012, the Jewish press reported, this was reported on January 24th of 2014, but it goes back to 2012, and Mahmoud Abbas's plan to destroy Zionism. That was the title of the article. Let me quote from some of it. The PLO issued a detailed 56-page strategy document at the end of 2012. And the PLO has been following the plan slavishly. But one of the points mentioned was, quote, to develop a strategy to work with Israeli society, particularly with the forces that supported the principle of 2 states on the 1967 borders. Quote, all those peace-loving Israeli leftist groups who enthusiastically meet Palestinian Arab officials, until the smart ones see the truth, are unwittingly part of the plan to divide and destroy Zionism and eventually the Jewish state. Why is it that so many leftists live on emotions and desires? Certainly everyone would like to see peace in that region and absence of wars. And the Jews and the Arabs, call them Palestinians or what, living side by side in peace. But the reality is, that's a dream. History teaches us that the PLO, the Palestinian Authority, has no such desire. So why base your actions on these false premises? As the leftists in Israel and leftists around the world do. It is unbelievably naive. July 19th, 2013 on PA TV. PA Minister of Religious Affairs Mahmoud al-Habash stated this, quote, the Palestinian leadership's sense of responsibility towards its nation made it take political steps about 20 years ago. In other words, the signing of the Oslo Accords. Despite the controversy, despite much criticism and much opposition by some, it brought us to where we are today. We have a Palestinian Authority, and the world recognizes the Palestinian state. All this never would have happened through Hamas's impulsive adventure, but only through the wisdom of the leadership, conscious action, consideration, and walking the right path, which leads to achievement, exactly like the prophet Muhammad did in the treaty or the pact of Hudaybiyah, even though some opposed it. December 2013, official Syrian satellite TV, there was a member of the Fatah Central Committee, Abbas Zaki, and he said, quote, you can relax. We find ourselves united for the first time. Even the most extreme among us, Hamas or the fighting forces, want a state within the 67 borders. Afterward, we will have something to say because the inspiring idea cannot be achieved all at once. Rather, in stages. The phased program of 1974. January 19, 2016, in an interview with the Ma'an news agency, Tawfiq Tarawi, a member of the Fatah Central Committee, said, quote, Palestine stretches from the river to the sea. A Palestinian state in the 1967 borders, with Jerusalem as its capital, is just a phase as far as I am concerned. Nothing's changed. Nothing's changed from 1964 and the establishment of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Actually, the only thing I guess that has changed is the foolishness of the world to accept that there's a Palestinian state and a Palestinian Arab people who want peace. Here, for example, was a proposed Palestinian state in the present negotiations a couple of years ago. Now, this will likely, possibly change in whatever details the Trump administration offers ultimately as a proposal to end this conflict. At the time of the making of this DVD, that has not been released. But you can see how short the distance is at one point, 9 miles for the nation of Israel. 9 miles in width. Well, December 23rd, 2016, we have UN Resolution 2334. What that did was seek to relitigate and rewrite the cornerstone UN Resolution 242. UN Watch posted an article, 12 Reasons Why the U.S. Should Have Vetoed UN Resolution 2334. This was published on December 28, 2016. I quote, "By injecting new language enshrining the 4th of June 1967 lines, the resolution seeks to relitigate and rewrite UN Security Council Resolution 242 of November 1967. The cornerstone of Arab-Israeli peace negotiations over the past half-century, endorsed by the Palestinians at Oslo, which calls for the right of every state to live in peace within secure and recognized boundaries, and for Israel to withdraw from territories occupied." Now the language is very specific and important. From territories occupied. Your predecessor, the article goes on, Arthur Goldberg, former Supreme Court Justice and U.S. Ambassador to the UN, when 242 was enacted, made clear that the text's notable omission in language on withdrawal are the words "the," "all," and the June 5th, 1967 lines. So the language was very specific, chosen for a purpose. The choice of language, the article goes on, was clear, he explained. Quote, "There is lacking a declaration requiring Israel to withdraw from the or all the territories occupied by it on and after June 5th, 1967. Now, historically, Israel did not occupy that territory. We looked at that. But regardless, the world accepts that as a fact now. It's not a fact, but that's what they accept. And so based on that UN resolution that goes back to 1967, as we read on, instead, the resolution stipulates withdrawal from occupied territories without defining the extent of withdrawal. And it can be inferred from the incorporation of the words secure and recognized boundaries that the territorial adjustments to be made by the parties in their peace settlements could encompass less than a complete withdrawal of Israeli forces from occupied territory. Goldberg likewise told King Hussein in the lead up to 242 that there was, quote, "a need for some territorial adjustment," end of quote, and end of that article. January 21st, 2017. Donald Trump is inaugurated as the 45th President of the United States. It wasn't but about a month after that, February 15th, that President Donald Trump, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu would meet at the White House. President Trump has become a great friend of Israel, perhaps the greatest friend of Israel of any president since Israel's creation. In an article written on February 15, 2017, Ann Garan and Ruth Eglosh, this was published in the Washington Post. This is the name of the article. White House reveals its ending long discredited and deadly two-state strategy. They wrote this: as the President has made clear, his administration will work to achieve a comprehensive agreement that would end the Israeli-Palestinian conflict so that Israelis and Palestinians can live in peace and security. White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer said Tuesday. Quote, the way forward in this article toward that goal will also be discussed. Trump's swaggering new sheriff posture in defense of Israel on the world stage has raised a lot of hopes in Israel, said Yoaz Hendel, an Israeli military historian who chairs the Institute for Zionist Strategies. Maybe, he said, the Messiah is there, and they're going to change everything, Hendel joked, as he characterized the pro-settler view that the American president might reverse years of Republican and Democratic policy by greenlighting a West Bank building boom. Jonah Goldberg, on the same day, February 15, 2017, wrote a column. Middle East conflict describes more than just Israeli-Palestinian dispute. He reported this. Republican State Department veteran Elliot Abrams writes in the Weekly Standard that the Trump administration may be going for an outside-in strategy rather than an inside-out one. Instead of using an Israeli-Palestinian deal to improve Israel's relations with the Arab states, use Israel's relations with the Arab states to advance an Israeli-Palestinian peace deal, Abrams writes. This is extremely important, especially in light of biblical prophecy. In February of 2017, February 20th, Israeli Public Security Minister Gilad Erdan, speaking at the conference of presidents of major Jewish organizations in Jerusalem, said this, quote, we have an opportunity to create, together with the administration, the conditions for serious peace negotiations by changing the basic approach of the international community. I believe that peace is possible. Every time Israel had a real partner for peace, we were willing to take far-reaching steps. If we have a true partner for peace, and we have to check that we have a true partner, we can make a deal. As some like to say, you probably know who I'm talking about. Close quote. Now the problem is they don't have a true partner for peace. That's been proven over and over and over again. And the intent of the Palestinian Authority is no different today than it was when the Palestinian Liberation Organization was formed in 1964. But what is important is the approach to peace. No longer an inside-outside attempt. In other words, let's first get a peace between Israel and the Palestinians, and then we can go outside that to the greater Arab world and hopefully get peace between Israel and the Arab world. No, the outside-in position is that first, let's see if we can get the Arab world to come to peace with Israel. And that is what is exactly happening in our world today. And when that comes to fruition, the Arab world will pressure the Palestinians, the Palestinian Authority, to enter into a peace agreement with Israel. The lies, the misinformation of the liberal media, the Arab world, the nations of the world, about the Israel-Palestinian issue will never be exposed, unfortunately, to the great majority of the world. We know there will be a peace plan, accepted by all the parties, not based on the Oslo Accords, but based on Daniel chapter 9, verse 27. And what is being talked about today by the administration of Donald Trump is an outside-in strategy, which parallels what Daniel 9:27 talks about, a peace treaty between Israel and her enemies. The unexpected election of Donald Trump in 2016 has opened the door to an Israel-Palestinian Arab world agreement, the outside-inside approach that lines up with Daniel 9:27. There will likely be surprises in the geopolitical makeup of the Middle East in the days ahead. We don't know what might alter the present alignment. We do know that we are commanded to pray for the peace of Jerusalem. The lies, the misinformation, the strategy of the PLO, the Palestinian Authority, the desire to destroy Israel will never come to fruition, because the God of the universe, the God of Israel, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has promised that the sons of Jacob will never be destroyed. We, though, are commanded to pray for the peace of Jerusalem. The answer to that prayer is when Jesus returns and sets up his kingdom, that messianic kingdom, that millennial reign. Don't be fooled by what the world tells you about the Israel-Palestinian issue. But do pray for the peace of Jerusalem. Shalom.